Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to Industry Insights, episode 54. Awesome to have you with us. If you are tuning in for the first time or in a long time, we are now actually going to do part two of a three-part series that we're going to double click on. But before we get to that, I want to introduce, of course, Jason Buffington. How are you this morning, Jason? And you do have to give us a little view of what you're wearing there.
So this is my weekly "Why BaaS When You Can DRaaS" shirt. I have been saying that on Twitter and on speeches for several years, and the nice folks at Global Data Vault actually were kind enough to actually make me a shirt and even gave me credit for the quote. So that's nice. And in fact, this week we're actually going to answer that question, right? Why BaaS? Or when you can DRaaS. We're going to cover both of them today. So.
Outstanding. And speaking, welcome wherever you're tuning in from. Do encourage you to give a shout out in the LinkedIn comments. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We can see the production staff here. I'm in Colorado. Jason's in Texas. Our producers in Georgia. And on social, we've got Romania in the house, but love to see where you're coming from. And without further ado, also, want to say, pose any questions, pose any comments as well. So this is, as I mentioned, part two of a three-part series around backup as a service, or BaaS, disaster recovery as a service, or DRaaS. But Jason, take us through a little bit about what we see here on the screen, about what we've been covering and how we even got this material.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been working on a lot at Veeam lately is a lot of more strategic research. So looking at unbiased audiences and what is they really want out of IT and out of data protection. This is a preview of some data that just came off of some unbiased research. Over 1,000 organizations, IT decision makers from organizations of all sizes, from small business, mid-market, lower and upper commercial, and then lower and upper enterprise, all asking questions around what does cloud-powered data protection look like? What should it look like? And really just to make sure that Veeam continues to build the kinds of cloud-powered data protection solutions that folks are looking for. We'll do the report out sometime in the August, late July timeframe, but we want to do a sneak peek for the folks at home on live stream. And so last week we looked at just truly, what does BaaS mean? What is it people are trying to accomplish with that? This week, we're going to look more at the drivers for either adopting or not adopting BaaS and DRaaS solution outcomes. And then I'm really excited about next week. Next week, BaaS and DRaaS doesn't happen without service providers, right? So how do you choose the right service provider for your BaaS and DRaaS outcomes? So let's get into week two.
Outstanding. A quick shout out. If you want to see last week's episode, meaning what is BaaS, you can check that out still on our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel as well. And that goes for really all of our past live streams, as well as some of the great stuff that our colleagues are putting out there. So if you did happen to miss that, you can go and check that out. Or if you happen to miss, say, next week's, when we finalize this on the third installment, you can check that out as well. So, Jason, let's, without further ado, double click into this. You mentioned that we came up with some global survey data here. We've got an N of around, I'll call it roughly 750, just give or take. And this is looking at people that are currently using backup as a service. Chat a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, and actually for this survey, the N was 1,050. Of those, they had to either be currently using or plan on using cloud-powered data protection within one budget cycle. So first, we asked the current users, that's the 700 of the 1,000-ish, why is it that they use backup as a service or a cloud-powered data protection solution in lieu of traditional backup hardware software that many organizations are familiar with? And like normal, the darker green lines is you can choose all that apply. The bright green is when you can only choose one, what's the most important. And I think we see really kind of two meta trends that comes out of this. If you look for most common response, that's the dark green coming towards that right-hand edge, the most common reason that you use BaaS is data survivability. Get your data out of the building. Right. And I've been saying that since my book came out in 2010, and it's still true today. When you look past that, though, you really see economics as the top line driver, and you see that in a couple ways. Certainly, OpEx versus CapEx as the most common reason for BaaS on the top side. So just being, I want to use backup, but I want to pay for what I'm using, and I don't want to have an investment stack. So I get that. But take a look at some of the other things. If you look on the dark green on that right-hand side, take a look at the other things that really spiked. Not only do we see OpEx and CapEx, so that's consumption factor, go near the bottom, 39%, freeing up internal resources for other projects. That sure sounds like human costs to me. And other physical assets. We see 38% hardware upgrades. So it really is. There's the data survivability and then almost a three-way tie for economics and efficiency, if you will. So that's why the current users are doing it. I found it to be really interesting and somewhat justifiable. Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting how cost manifests itself in a few different ways. Whether that's the switching of the model, meaning OpEx to CapEx, whether it's, I don't want to be in the on stack and rack business. It's, down towards the end there, avoid costly hardware, or it's just a generic, I want to reduce costs. But one of the ones I like to double click on is actually number 3, and that is senior leadership is driving a cloud first strategy. And I can remember quite some time ago talking to backup teams when I was an industry analyst saying, regardless of what you think about the cloud as it relates to availability, your boss's boss's boss, and just insert however many of those you need to before you get to the CIO, is probably favorably thinking, meaning predisposition to believing that going forward further faster in the cloud is positive. Now, some period of time later, and no small part thanks to the pandemic, this is probably resurgent. So I always look at this as an opportunity to tell people, if you're looking for something to demonstrate to the business what you're doing in the cloud, actually availability is a fantastic area to focus on.
Totally agree with that. Now, by the way, it would be very easy to look at a chart like this because we did cover organizations of all sizes and say, well, maybe this is true for, the SMB, or maybe this is true for, some other segment. We asked that question. We actually cut the same question. Let's go ahead and go to the second slide. Same answer. But instead of just having the main reason, we now cut the main reason by small and mid-sized businesses, which is the bluish green, commercial, so 250 to 999, that's in the middle, that dark teal, and then enterprises being that brightish yellow green along the way. And guess what? There's just not that much difference. Right? So, the top reasons are the top reasons. Dave, I think to your point, enterprises is actually slightly lower on cloud first strategy than one might have assumed compared to the other two segments. But I honestly think that's because enterprises are further along on a cloud first strategy. It'd be like saying, hey, when I'm looking for a phone, I want it to always have a dial tone. We're kind of past that on the enterprise. Enterprises, they've moved from just making sure that data protection is cloud powered to making sure that production has a cloud first stance on it. And then, of course, you would assume that protection comes right behind that. But other than that, it's a really consistent map. The main reasons for BaaS are the main reasons for BaaS. Doesn't matter how big or small you are.
Yeah, and I just want to double click on that again, because one of the fun things to do when you do get global research, and this research, no one knew it was Veeam asking this. This is a blind or independent survey, and it's really the voice of the people, if you will, about 1,000 plus people. And just putting a finer point that availability as a service, whether that's backup as a service, disaster recovery as a service, is not unique to any vertical, company size, or geography. So an enormous amount of commonality in here. I'll double down again. I maintain that the pandemic is partially driving this, but I think also just across the data center, everyone's interested in changing out that flexible payment model from OpEx versus CapEx. So it is something that's germane to all organizations. I think regardless of whether or not today your organization is considering a BaaS or DRaaS kind of an approach in the future, you owe it to yourself to at least get educated. I know, Jason, that's kind of been one of our mantras and why we like sharing this data, even in some cases months before we actually publish a formal report, is regardless of your interest in Veeam or not, you owe it to yourself to get educated, make the best possible decision that you can.
Yeah, and I think I love what you said about, this is not an SMB thing. This is not a vertical thing. This is not a geo thing, right? So this is obviously this phenomena of I want backup to work better, right? We see that from the Data Protection Trends Report. Well, what's one of the ways that you make it work better? Put it on a superior platform, right? And I'm not saying that the cloud is necessarily superior to on-premise, but typically what comes with backup as a service and DR as a service is smarter humans, people that live and breathe backup all day long. And so that little bitty error message that you never noticed before, they see that every day. They fix that every day. Right. And so when we look at the appetite for BaaS and DRaaS, I don't think it's necessarily just because I don't want to run my own backup server. It's because I just don't want to think about the headache. Right. And I want it just to work, and I want it to work better. And I could soapbox on this, but I think I soapboxed on last week. So y'all should just hit repeat on that instead. But OK, so these were the 700 of the 1,000 folks that are currently using BaaS. Let's take that next look, though, and look at, of the plan to users, not currently using, but plan to. And then it's probably time to hit the map after that. But let's take a look at the plan tos, because I think it kind of rounds out the story a little bit. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I guess I cut that part. So we're going to go into the why not. Do you want to go to the map instead?
Yeah, let's see where people are tuning in from, because I just got an update from our team in Romania. Look at that. We always like the big old geos when they come in. Look at Canada there. We've also got some additional United States, meaning Florida, South Carolina, Ohio, Illinois, and of course, Canada, as I mentioned, Toronto in this particular case. So thank you for that. If we look at some of the other locations, we've got the United Kingdom,
France, Spain. All right.
Scotland, Turkey, the Czech Republic, France, yes, as you mentioned, and Tunisia and Nigeria are also with us. Outstanding.
And is that India over in the far right-hand corner? We can always count on them piling on. So
outstanding. Thank you. Please keep that coming. And if you do have questions, comments, love to hear from that as well. So yeah, let's double click on sort of the converse now, Jason. Everything has its positive or negative, and maybe that's a little too harsh of a word, but there's reasons for, reasons not. Let's double click on the sentiment here.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah, take us through what you saw here in your initial read.
So the big thing here anytime that you talk about why not the cloud, right? Every time, it always comes down to security. It's always the top choice, right? So here you can see it's the most common response overall. By the way, this particular data included both the current users and the plan to. So this is the 1,050, the entire N. And what they said was they had concerns about security, right? And simply exposing that data for cyber. We talked about that a few months ago when we looked at IaaS adoption. Also very common and for BaaS has been for as long as you and I have been using the word, has been concerns about recovery speed coming back from that as well. And I got to tell you, my favorite approach to solving that number two is I know a lot of BaaS service providers that will actually drop a local appliance that they manage onto your on-prem, right? So now it is cloud managed, it is economics, that's cloud consumption, and yet you get those local SLAs, which I just think is a brilliant hybrid in its own right. But I think the thing I would tell folks is if, and this is maybe a little bit of a preview towards next week, how do you choose a service provider? If the number one reason that you're concerned about BaaS is security, then I'm going to tell the service providers out there, if you go to your website and a customer can't figure out in the first 30 seconds that environment is secure and that data is pristine, not only from the outside world, not only from the hackers, but even from the BaaS provider personnel themselves, then frankly, you are probably marketing wrong, because this is what people say they're looking for first and foremost. Amen?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, I feel like since the cloud in any way, shape, or form has been discussed, the number one data center objection has always been security. Throw your body on the tracks and say, this is not going to be secure. And the reality is, of course, it depends. Of course, you could implement a cloud-based solution that's less secure, much like you could an on-premises one as well. But I like your point, Jason, that service providers from the beginning of their offerings have had to have this box checked, right? This concern addressed. And obviously it's becoming even more important as we see. So I think that people got it right, meaning I want to be concerned about that. Yeah. But here's where the due diligence comes is choose wisely. And as you say, we'll double click on that next week. But inherently, a delivery model does not have to be more or less secure in this context, is my belief.
Yeah, back when you and I were both analysts, I remember running a report, and the first time I looked at data protection as a service, and we asked, what was the main concern? It was security. We also asked other users, what were the benefits that you got from embracing backup as a service? And enhanced security was actually one of the top responses. So I went off and I interviewed a whole bunch of CIOs and said, okay, how do you get both? Right. And what they told me was if you upgrade your legacy on-prem backup solution with another on-prem backup solution, you're probably using the same kind of agent technology. You're using the same logins for all the backup service accounts. Data is not encrypted in flight when you're in the data center. Data is typically not encrypted at rest when you're in the data center. So if you're just doing the status quo and you change vendors, you didn't really improve your security stance at all. But as soon as you now embrace the cloud, all those security holes, or at least a lot of them, start getting filled. And the data is encrypted in flight. The data is encrypted at rest. I mean, there's a lot more controls that come into that. I think it's a naysayer question and an opportunity for BaaS providers to differentiate. But there is no reason in my mind that BaaS shouldn't be lauded as potentially more secure, not less, if you do it right.
Yeah, and I want to pick on a few things that came out a little lower in the list, meaning pick in terms of let's highlight them. I actually like the notion that's about middle to slightly below middle here, concern on bandwidth consideration. I like that because absolutely networking and bandwidth in this context should be top of mind. And I've heard more than a few people say, including yourself, I believe, Jason, that especially when it comes to disaster recovery as a service, one of the things that really stands out of having to get right and where you need to put a lot of focus is in the connectivity or the networking side. So I think the 7, in terms of check your primary concern, I actually would have voted that higher up on the list. And it's not because can a provider give that to you or not, meaning meet the necessary bandwidth, but you want to make sure that you check that box. You want to understand whether or not you've actually got the capability to meet your SLA.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, when you think about bandwidth, you should be thinking not only about the 7% that's about 2/3 down the way, but also add that number 2 one back in, right? Recovery speed from the internet, because that's where you're presuming that you've got egress coming down from that BaaS provider. But Dave, I think you're right, because what a lot of folks don't understand is network is not free, right? So if you decide that you want to start backing this stuff up, even just your backup sends is going to take some bandwidth. It's going to be just a little bit of bandwidth if you're doing backup. It's going to be more bandwidth if you're doing replication for disaster recovery. It's going to be more bandwidth if you're using CDP because you're using VMware between sites, right? Going to say cloud-hosted virtualization instead. So the more recurring that you want to protect your data, all that outbound bandwidth is still matters. So yes, absolutely, you want to be planning for that as part of your strategy.
And little shout out, if you will, to vendor lock-in. I think that's appropriate to look in as well. I had a colleague time to consider your exit strategy from any as a service endeavor is before you actually undertake doing a partnership or conducting business with them.
Yeah, I mean, back in those same days, I would tell people that if you choose poorly on backup as a service, it's like Hotel California, right? You can check out, but you can never leave, because once you put your data in there, if you have any kind of regulatory requirements around long-term retention, that data has to be pristine and untouched for that whole 7-year, 10-year, whatever, because as soon as you touch it, you risk breaking chain of custody, and the lawyers will be more than happy to invalidate your recovery set that comes from that. It's one of the reasons why I really like those backup as a service providers that offer tape as a service as one of their extended options, so that you don't have lock-in, so that if they catch on fire just like you did or whatever it happens to be, go take those tapes, right, and go pull from there instead, and you get chain of custody and you get e-litigation. I mean, there's a whole bunch of benefits that come out of that, including mitigating vendor lock-in.
Yeah, great point. And just a little technical note, think we had a server failure, a com failure somewhere along the way. We've relaunched. So if you're rejoining back in, thank you very much. If you're watching after the fact, that's what happened. So without further ado, kind of want to go maybe to the next one. We've mentioned the word or acronym DRaaS a few different times. Now, why don't we actually take a little look about what people are actually doing in this area?
Yeah. So, and this is where I will point folks to my shirt again. Why BaaS when you can DRaaS, right? So BaaS, the basic concept is of if you're doing backup to a cloud, you're going to recover that data from the cloud. Maybe you're going to recover it to an IaaS set of infrastructure, to a secondary site, or just pull it back right where it came from, right? But DRaaS takes that to a whole nother level and really gets you to, hey, if I have a problem, I'm just going to power it up. I'm going to bring up whole VMs, not files and folders, and I'm just going to redirect my users and go from there. And what I love about this DRaaS data from the current users is that it's much bigger and broader than just data survivability and economics, right? That's what we said why people use BaaS. Take a look at these top options. Use the dark greens on that far right-hand side. Cost efficiency, resource sharing, yes, absolutely. Freeing up resources, absolutely. But take a look at the other ones. That's kind of a six-way tie. Remotely managed and operated. Service providers are huge for expertise in this space because DRaaS is more complicated, right? Cloud-first strategy. I love that executives are still seeing this. This is different than just I want to store my data out of the building. This is about I don't want to have a secondary data center sitting idle waiting, right? Improve requirements for around compliance. Reducing complexity, right? The one thing you don't want to do during a DR scenario is be looking up folders and processes and scripts. And so whatever you can use for orchestration and workflows comes out of that. So there's almost a six-way tie for reasons why you should DRaaS. And it's more than survivability of data and it's cheaper, right? That's what people need to hear is it's strategically important to the business.
Yeah, and I'll sort of stick with my theme of, let's go cherry pick a few things that maybe ranked a little lower on the list, but maybe, in my opinion, deserve a little bit of a call out. Obviously, sure. This list is, kind of a barometric reading of a point in time. How are people thinking of using this today? However, going forward, I would really encourage people to think in that middle of the list where we see scalability and granularity, but especially scalability. I think that's worth double clicking on, because you don't have to make this move all at once. You can begin by moving certain workloads, or if you're a larger organization, different business units, different geographies, different locations, et cetera, into this type of model and see if it works well for you. The other thing I want to do now, completely other end of the spectrum, Jason, I look down below. I see testing or, quote, sandbox environment at 2%. As I understand why it might be lower, but I just cannot help but give a shout out for, hey, this is a fantastic use case of disaster recovery as a service. This is a capability that for a variety of reasons, I think people ought to exploit. One, we always promote testing, really at Veeam, but you and I individually for quite some time. But two, leveraging your secondary data, meaning your backups, your DR copies, et cetera, for improving your production capabilities is absolutely at the heart, in my mind, of digital transformation, or at least very supportive of that initiative.
Yeah. So for folks at home, write this down on a Post-it note. You could pay for your DRaaS by adding sandboxing. And what I mean by that is there is so much value that comes out of doing sandboxing and testing, whether it's risk mitigation, data forensics, data analysis, data mining, all those things that happen if you could just restand up some of your servers in a quiesced environment and play with it. And you know what? That's what DRaaS does, right? It lets you stand up and test for that. The other thing that I really want folks, take a screenshot of this, because if you look on the left-hand side in the words, I hope it kind of sticks out to folks where it says twice, expertise on BCDR. Right? Those are two really key aspects of why you should be choosing DRaaS, because not only do you get secondary infrastructure, you also get people that are smarter than you at BCDR, right? This is not backup on steroids. It takes a lot of different kinds of work to think about What are the business processes that really matter? What are the IT services those business processes depend on? How do you stand up servers again when they went down in Dallas and they woke up in Denver? Right? That takes expertise that a lot of staffs don't have on site. You should be thinking about DRaaS as if you get built-in BCDR outsource expertise if you choose the right partner. So I think those are huge reasons why you should be thinking about DRaaS, is to get smarter humans that can actually spell BCDR better than you.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a slight variant on it. I completely agree with what you said, but there's a sort of an adjacent aspect to this in my mind. I know I said earlier that one of the most difficult things I often hear from others about disaster recovery is the networking angle. That's obviously more of a technical statement. However, what I've observed for quite some number of years, decades, is that the business aspect of defining a plan, keeping a plan up to date, et cetera. I call that non-technical. I'm sure there's technicalities or issues involved with that, of course, but it's part of the overlay of getting additional people to come help you is having a process to either define or refine your business continuity practice, because so many of these initiatives either don't get off the ground because they don't really formalize a plan or get the buy-in for a plan up front. Or worst case scenario in my mind is it's just like, someone did the backups but then fail on restore and they never tested. That's horrible. And so if you find out later on, we had a plan, we actually thought we had buy-in, we did all these things we thought were correct, that happened to be 2 years ago. We had configuration drift. Process
and culture, huge facets of any BCDR strategy. And again, you're not going to take the backup admin and say, and now I'm going to teach you how to do BCDR, right? If you really want to materially affect process and culture, it's going to take somebody with some fresh ideas. It's one of the things I like best about DRaaS type scenarios.
Awesome. Well, let's hit the map one last time. I think we've got about 5 new countries in.
There you go. Brazil's in the house.
Jason gets tell him why. Why do you get excited on Brazil?
Because
I do too.
They know how to do meat almost as well as Texans. And the wine is pretty good down there too. So yes, I love it when Brazil's in the house.
And looking around, we've got Austria, Oman, and United Arab Emirates. The UAE, we actually have had, I would say, this entire calendar year, Jason, fantastic representation from. So shout out to them. And then in the United States, we also have Atlanta, Georgia, that's come into the house. Our producer's in another area of Georgia, but we've got additional representation. So appreciate that.
Florida, Ohio, great state of Illinois.
There we go. So as we begin to wind down, want to give just a reminder, a shout out to next week, the third final installment of our as a service kind of double click. And when we're going to be talking about how to choose a provider for BaaS or DRaaS. But speaking of send to hens, Jason, we do want to also highlight that our colleague David Hill and a good friend Sam Nichols are going to be going into a deep dive about why AWS backup must be native versus replatforming tools.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that. Obviously, as we talked about earlier, for all those organizations, they're having 2 kinds of conversations: moving their data protection solutions to the cloud, which we're covering on the Mondays, and then to have Sam and David talking about moving production to the cloud, making sure that stays backed up. And by the way, these are not separate conversations. If you have production-based workloads in the cloud, why wouldn't you use a cloud service to back those up? So absolutely, this is part and parcel.
And I won't steal their thunder, but I'd also say round trip ability, data portability, cloud mobility becomes a consideration as well, because to the point about concern of lock-in, which did rate fairly low, it is an important thing to think about. And so I know without a doubt that David and Sam will be covering that as well.
Well, and of course, in our data protection trends report, we asked organizations, what does modern data protection look like? Being able to move workloads from one cloud to another, private to public, public A to public B, all of those fare pretty heavily if you have the right data protection solution.
Well said. Well, with that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream. Thank you.
Take care.